Well, there was a fifth grade teacher that gave an assignment to her class, and the assignment was to go home and ask your parents to tell a story that had a moral to it. And so the next day, the teacher asked for volunteers, and Lucy raised her hand. And yes, Lucy, what's your story? And Lucy said, well, my daddy's a farmer, and we raise, we have hens, and we have eggs, and we take the eggs to market, and we sell them. And one day, we had all our eggs in a basket on the front chair of the pickup truck, and we hit a bump in the road, and the eggs went flying and landed everywhere, and it was a big mess. And the teacher said, and what's the moral of the story? Well, the moral of the story is, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Oh, splendid, Lucy, thank you for that story. Does somebody else have a story? And Jane said, yes, I have a story. My daddy's also a farmer, and we raise chickens and take them to the meat market. And one weekend we had about 12 chickens or 12 eggs that were about to be hatched, and we were so excited we were going to take those 12 chickens. When they finally hatched, only 10 of the chickens were alive. And the teacher said, well, what's the moral of the story? And she said, well, the moral of the story is don't count your chickens before they're hatched. Oh, that's such a lovely story. Thank you so much, Jane. Well, one little boy, Johnny, could not help himself. Teacher, teacher, teacher. And so she called on Johnny against her better judgment. And Johnny said, well, now what's your story, Johnny? And he said, well, my daddy told me the story of Aunt Karen. Really, Aunt Karen? Well, tell us about Aunt Karen. Well, Aunt Karen was a flight engineer on an airplane during Desert Storm. And her plane was hit, and it was going down, and she had just seconds to eject. And so she grabbed three things around her. She grabbed a machine gun, a machete, and a bottle of whiskey as she ejected the plane. And on the way down, she drank almost the whole bottle of whiskey on the way down. And when she landed on the ground, she realized there were about 100 enemy soldiers around her. She killed about 80 of them with a machine gun until she ran out of ammunition. And then she killed another 15 with a machete until the blade broke. And she killed the last 5 with her bare hands. And the teacher was just horrified, for these fifth graders. And she said, oh, good heavens. So, well, what could be the possible moral of this story? Well, my daddy told me that don't be around Aunt Karen when she's been drinking. An important lesson to remember about life. Well, we've been doing a series called Isolation, and the idea of the series is why does God call us into community? Why is that important? And so we are in week 7. If you have missed some of these, I'd encourage you to go back and read these or listen to these from our website. Well, our passage today comes from Romans 12, 9 through 21, and it's a great little passage, 13 verses that have to do with relationships. And as we get into this, I just want to kind of cut this text in 3 different slices. The biggest slice, as we'll see, is that there are 2 big words that you pick up, or 2 big ideas in this passage, and one is learn and act. Learn. The idea of learning is that we are always in the process all of our life of learning how to love. If I assume, or you assume, that your love capacity or quotient is good enough, you're badly mistaken. We are always going to be in the laboratory of love, learning how to love, no matter how long we live. And the second one is action. Now, when I think about the laboratory of love and learning how to do this, I think about my college years. I was a pre-med major, as a lot of you know, for 3 years. And one of the hardest courses I had was organic chemistry. And it was hard for virtually everybody. We started out with 150 in the class, and by the spring final, we had about 75 left. So it's hard enough learning all these formulas and the theory about chemistry. But there was something even harder than that for me, and that was the lab. When I would go to the lab, every time I went without fail, I had this haunting sense that I really didn't know what I was doing. And so there were instructions. You're supposed to follow the instructions. And some of you know I'm not as detailed people are. And I just had this haunting sense that I was going to do something, mix chemicals the wrong way or some way. And there was going to be this explosion that was going to burn out my retinas, or that I was going to blow up the chemistry lab. Now, that lasted every time I went to the lab for a year. Now, what finally dawned on me is that the professors of the chemistry department made sure that could not happen. They made it sure that a catastrophic event could not happen with somebody like me in there. Now, but the purpose of the lab was to practice, to learn, for trial and error to happen, so where you can actually learn some of the important things about chemistry. Now, the same is true in a church community. We are a lab. Nobody has this love thing down perfectly. Not any of us. We are always going to be learning how to do that. And what that tells us is, it says something about the necessity of humility. I always have something to learn about how I relate to people. I don't care how good your marriage is, how good your relationships are with your kids or your parents, neighbors, friends, etc. There's always something to learn. I have to be in the learning mode. The second thing that we'll see in our passage is that love just doesn't happen. It has to be expressed. There has to be action, everyday action. Around here we call this building. We're in the process of building relationships in our families, our marriage, with our kids, with each other, neighbors. You're building relationships at work. And this takes initiative. Relationships have to continue to have energy and initiative put into them. Now, when I was a kid, I liked models. And, if you're the oldest brother in a family and you like models, this is not good. Because my little brother also liked models, but he liked my models. And always played with my models. And usually when he played with my models, they got destroyed. Now, I got this from Amazon. And you would think that this would be an easy thing to put together. And I was reminded that not only was it a good thing I didn't become a doctor, it was a good thing that I didn't become an engineer. Putting this together took me hours. And one of the problems I had is that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 places, 6, 7 places where you're supposed to use double-sided tape. And I had the hardest time. I could get one side of the paper off the double-sided tape, but not the other. So what I ended up resorting to was glue. And, it takes time for glue to dry, and I ended up washing my hands with glue for a long time. Well, I finally got it together, and it did have its maiden voyage this morning, running into several things in my home. There's something that tells me I should not be doing this. A lot of you have seen my prop failures over the years. What's one more?
I get it. Prop failure.
Prop failure. That was good. I wish I'd thought of that. Okay, well, we're going to try voyage number 2 here, and we'll see what happens. Is it still in one piece? That's remarkable. Okay, now, when I was a kid, I loved balsa airplanes. And the reason that one of the reasons it can fly is the rubber band at the bottom. But if I want this plane to fly a second time, I'm going to have to do what you've already seen me do once. And that is now I gave it about 50 spins a minute ago. This morning I gave it 90, which was too much, and it crashed into 2 walls, but yet still managed to make it through. Now, relationships are like this balsa airplane. If it just sits here, it's a decoration. It's not going to fly. And if I have just the balsa and the wood pieces without the rubber band, I can throw it. It's not going to fly very far. But if I want it to fly like it's supposed to, it's going to take repeated effort every time I want it to fly by spinning this rubber band. Well, that's sort of an analogy of what Paul's going to tell us in our passage here. I'm always learning. And there's always initiative and action required. All right, well, let's look into our passage. Romans 12:3 is the context of our beginning. And Paul says, "For by the grace of God, I bid every one of you not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each one according to the measure of faith God has given him." So the passage has this context of humility. That as we're in this laboratory of love, trying to learn how to love one another, it's important that every one of us know, I have a long way to go. I have a lot to learn, and so do you. With that attitude, that gives us room for trial and error, and we are going to make mistakes and error. The next few verses 4 through 8, talk about that the church is a body and it has different members, and all the members are different and have different functions. And so there's this concept of we are seeking to be united and learning how to be united, even with diversity. The same principle is true in a marriage or with raising children or at work as you're relating to different people. You're trying to be united, build unity while people are different. Now, as we get a little bit deeper into this passage, what struck me from this passage the last couple of weeks is that Paul talks about 5 big picture items that should frame how we think about relationships. And then the rest of the passage has to do with lots of different actions that we can do to build relationships. So we're going to look at the 5 big picture items that struck me. Number 1, I will always need to learn to love better. That is true until I die. I will always be learning, and so will you. Number 2, pursue being united even though we are diverse. There's this thing that always happens with us is that we always think we have to think the same way and do the same kind of things and do it the same. And that's not true. That's a bad ideal. We seek to be united even though diverse. Third, each member belongs to the other. Think about this. Each of us belongs to each other. How would you have to think about yourself to have that kind of mindset toward the people sitting around you? I belong to you. You belong to each other. In some ways, you belong to me. There's something about the nature of how we see ourselves and relationships here that's important. The fourth one is to be devoted to one another. To be devoted to one another. Again, big picture item is how we think about ourselves and how we think about each other. It takes both these. And the fifth big picture, each of us is relationally responsible no matter how we are being treated. There's always a relationship, there's always a responsibility I have to respond correctly regardless of what I'm going through. Okay, those are the 5 big pictures. Now we'll go through what are the specifics that Paul tells us about how to build relationships. And this has to do a lot with actions. So we start in verse 9. Love must be sincere. Hate what is evil. Cling to what is good. Now, our culture is hopelessly naive when it comes to this thing of love. Our general secular culture defines love as feelings. And generally speaking, if that's how love really is, then about all you're going to be left with is the feelings of infatuation, or the feelings that come in a brand new relationship, whatever kind of relationship that is, work, marriage, dating, neighbors, etc. Or the third one is loving people who love you. Now, all 3 of those kinds of love are kindergarten love. You cannot build anything substantial on the basis of feelings. There's a different kind of love. So when Paul says, let love be sincere, what is he saying? Well, our secular culture would say, well, you can't really love somebody unless you feel loving. And the idea of loving somebody because it's the right thing to do, or out of your commitment to the person, or out of conviction, or because you have a moral obligation to love somebody, these are just not anywhere on the horizon in our secular culture at all. But this is the kind of love that goes from kindergarten love to junior high love to high school to college to grad school love. This is what Paul is encouraging us to do here. And when he says, love must be sincere, then what does he mean? Well, the Greek word sincere means without wax, and its primary application had to do with sculptors. And a sculptor could take out his hammer and chisel, and out of marble or granite or rock make some kind of statue. But at sometimes sculptors made a mistake. They're a little bit too hard with the hammer and chisel, and they would make a crack in the statue. And if you made a crack in the statue and you were trying to sell it, it would not bring as much money on the open market as one without cracks. And so what they would do is they would take some wax and melt it and fill the crack with wax, and after it dried, paint it. And then they could sell the statue as if it was truly made like it was supposed to. This is the word he uses here. What does he say when love must be sincere? Love must have the kind of love that's without cracks, is the idea. So what does he mean here? Well, all of our love has cracks in it. And to some extent, it always will, unfortunately. We will always be dealing with this. This is sort of the cancer of self that lies within us, the cancer of sin, which always makes relationships first me, then you. And of course, over time, this cancer of relationships can be very detrimental. A lot of relationships start out on a high, at 100%. And over time, this cancer inside of us, without us even knowing it, can slowly suck the life out of a relationship, where it might be down to 70 or 60 or 50. Over time, this kind of cancer, if it continues on, can go down to where, it's maybe like a 25 on a scale of 0 to 100, where it's really rough. The relationship is rough. Or it can become so much a part of who we are in our relationships that it's destructive, terribly destructive. Now, if you happen to watch the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial even a little bit, you saw how destructive this cancer in us can be. And unfortunately for those two folks, that was played out on a worldwide scale. Countless examples of this cancer inside slowly eating out. So what Paul says, love must be sincere. It's not going to be perfectly sincere without cracks, ever in my life. But what he's giving us is sort of a lifetime aspiration. You and I are always pursuing a better love that has fewer and fewer cracks. This is how he starts out this great passage. And he says, hate what is evil, cling to what is good. And I think that one of the applications here is he says, as you think about your love and the cracks that are in it, he said, think about when your love is not like it's supposed to be, why is that? Hate what is evil. So for me, sometimes my love falls short because I'm critical in my head. Or sometimes because I'm comparing myself to somebody else. Or because of expectations that I have, sometimes I'm not even aware of. And Paul says, hate those things. When you see those things pop up and start to tear away or cause cracks in your love, those are things to hate. Then the second thing is, hate what is evil, cling to what is good. And so here I think what he means are things like, I am going to be a loving man because it's the right thing to do. I'm going to be a loving man because I'm commanded to do it. I'm going to act in love out of my convictions and my commitments that I've made. He said, cling to those things in order to help deal with this problem of wax. Romans 12:10 says, be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another about yourselves. And here, what he gives us are two big picture things again, is how you think about other people really matters as you're trying to love people. Am I devoted to the people around me? And am I honoring the people around me? Now, honoring people, when I think about this in my life, is I honor people if I listen to their ideas, if I listen to their suggestions. I may not agree with their ideas or agree with their suggestions, but the least I can do is honor them by attentively listening and considering. Think about what that would do in our marriages or with our adult children or maybe your parents. And then verses 11 and 13. What strikes me here with these verses is in a culture that is bereft of meaning, Paul gives us some ways of finding meaning. Verse 11, never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with God's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. Never be lacking in zeal. Now, for a lot of years, I remember thinking that zeal for the Christian is my responsibility. That's the pastor's responsibility to provide, or the worship leader's responsibility, or the worship team's responsibility, or your small group leader's responsibility to help you have zeal. That's not how Paul thinks about this at all. As he writes to the church in Rome, he tells every one of those members, that's your job. Never be lacking in zeal. The responsibility is how. Now, of course, that begs the question, well, what is zeal? Is zeal feeling strong spiritual passion? And if you've heard, if you've been around our church for at least a few months, you know I don't believe that. When we have passion that feels like that, I'm happy about that. But this is something deeper. Never be lacking in zeal. What he's describing is, I am going to do what is right, not because I feel like doing it, but out of conviction that something is right, or out of commitment that something is right. I'm going to find a way to do what's right regardless of how I feel, or to love the people in my life regardless of how I'm treated. Now, how do we do that? Well, he gives us some examples. I think as he's writing this, his mind goes to these examples. Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. Zeal just doesn't happen just willy-nilly in my prayer closet. One of the ways this happens is as we serve the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. 3 more action steps that have to do with keeping zeal, meaning moving down the narrow road of life with Jesus in the forefront. Share with God's people who are in need, and practice hospitality. Now, in a world searching for meaning, these verses give great meaning to our lives. Meaning is not an individual sport. We find meaning when we're in community and relating as we're supposed to in community. I am not going to find very much meaning in my life in isolation. I have to engage and I have to take initiative. Then he moves to more difficult relationships, verse 14. Bless them which persecute you, bless and curse not. Now, if you happen to be one of those that think that love is still only about emotion, I don't know any time in my life where I have felt like blessing somebody who cursed me or treated me poorly. My emotions go in different directions than loving. And yet he says to bless those who persecute you. And the idea here is that I am going to do what I can for somebody else's good, no matter how I've been treated. And the opposite of this, and curse not, cursing is, the idea of cursing is calling down destruction from God upon somebody who's treated me poorly. So when people say, God, D word, you, what they don't know is that they're asking God's help for your destruction. They may not think it that way, but that's sort of what this verse implies. And he said that's a bad idea. Instead, rejoice with them that do rejoice, and weep with them that weep. Now, I love this verse. And maybe for some of you, maybe this verse is your takeaway. But there are 2 things that really strike me, and they're in your handout. Happiness shared multiplies happiness. There's a lot of happiness that I enjoy, not because I'm happy about what's happening with me, but it's because of what's happiness that some of you are enjoying. And I kind of piggyback on that. This is part of the joy of being in community. My joy doesn't depend just on my circumstances. I can enjoy almost as much as you what you enjoy. And the opposite is true regarding weep with those who weep. Sorrows shared divides our sorrows. Trying to carry a sorrow by myself is a bad idea. But carrying other people's sorrows helps them. Verse 16, live in harmony with one another. We have a visual of that every time we worship. To harmonize with the others who on the worship team here, you have to listen to what the other people are singing and adjust yourself to the others who are singing and to the worship leader. I can't just get up here and sing just the way I want to and for it to go well. Harmony, well, that's the imagery he says here. That's how we're to think about each other. How can I defer myself or what I want to the benefit of other people? That's harmonize. Do not be proud, but willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. And here what I take from these ideas here is that our pride is one of our nemesis. Expectations are driven by pride. And that's a bad idea. And so there are different things here that strike me. Am I expecting to be encouraged by somebody when I talk with them? Or am I hoping to get some kind of status back or affirmation back? Is that really what's driving how I relate? Paul says that those are bad ideas, driven by pride. And then he comes to the last part of this, relating to your enemies. And when I think of enemies, enemies don't have to be people that are suing you or are your mortal enemies. There are times when your spouse can feel like an enemy, even though most of the time they may not feel that way. But there are just those moments, or when your children can feel like an enemy. They're just those moments. So what strikes me here is that Paul gives, again, 4 action steps that we can do when we're in very difficult relationships. Verse 17, be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. No matter how you've been treated, he says your response is your responsibility. How you respond matters. Focus on your response, not how you've been treated. Secondly, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Now, what is inferred in this verse is it's not always possible to be at peace with everyone. And in my life, there are some people that no matter how hard I've tried to be at peace with, it just doesn't happen the way I wish it would. But I am still responsible to do what I can to try to move in that direction. Verse 19, do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. I don't know if there's anything harder to do when you've been treated poorly than to retaliate. It's very easy to do. And when I think about this, I remember one of the first lessons, or an early lesson in my marriage with Mindy was I don't remember what I was angry about, but it was one of those moments where you just think, this time I deserve to be angry. You know what I mean? You just think that you see everything the way it's supposed to be seen, and this is what should have been done, and it wasn't done, and you just know this time you're justified in your anger. And I don't remember what I said, but I'm sure I had to apologize for it afterwards, which happened many times our first year of marriage. And I remember thinking there, somehow, this is like one of those jujitsu things, where you think you're going after the person, you're going to take them down, and they take you down. Well, I got taken down on that. And one of the verses that I remembered from that little experience was James 1:20. The anger of man does not accomplish the righteousness of God. The anger of man does not accomplish the righteousness of God. Now, you see this in road rage. Somebody's mad because somebody did something to them. And whenever somebody retaliates in anger or rage, is there ever a time when the second person goes, oh, you know what? I think you're right. I'm so sorry. I was in the wrong. No, what happens is the opposite. The other person just becomes angrier or more infuriated at your rage. This is what James tells us is true about human anger. In other words, human anger is never a big enough spanky spoon when it comes to relationships. Now, God has a big spanky spoon, And when he wields it, he can make a difference. Verse 19, leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay. And then he finishes with two powerful verses. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. This is so unintuitive to human nature. It does remind me of a story from the Middle Ages of a knight who was on his horse, and he'd been off in battle, and he came back after months away, and he came back to the drawbridge came down, he walked on his horse, he came in, and the king met him. And the soldier, the knight, looked like he had been through all kinds of wars. He was all dented up, his armor and his sword was broken, and his horse was limping, and he was leaning over to the side, barely able to sit up in the saddle. And the king said to the knight, "Oh, Sir Knight, what have you been doing?" He said, "Well, I've been pillaging and burning and killing your enemies to the west." And the king said, "I don't have any enemies to the west." The knight said, "I think you do now." If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something. So what's he saying here? He said, rather than take revenge, think about what need does this person have and what can I do to meet it? Now, he uses two examples of food or drink, hunger and thirst, or it can be some type of physical need or financial need or relational need. I have a friend that had somebody that was really, really mad at him in his neighborhood. And when the other guy that was mad was away for vacation, my friend mowed his yard while he was gone twice. And when the guy came back, he expected to see his grass really tall, and it wasn't. And he found out later that the guy that he was really mad at had mowed his grass twice. Sometimes you're going to take lunch to somebody at work. You may not eat it with them, or cupcakes, or cookies, or flowers for a woman who's going through a tough time at work. Now, the principle here is undeserved kindness. God's role is Mr. Big Spanky Spoon. My role is undeserved kindness. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And the idea of being overcome is to be vanquished, to be defeated. Now, how are we defeated when this happens? We become defeated when somebody treats us poorly and we retaliate. We fight fire with fire, back with the same kind of thing that we were given. Then everybody loses, including you and me. To not be overcome by evil is to follow what Paul recommends here in these verses, particularly undeserved kindness. Of course, this reminds me, as we close here, of the gospel, and this is what Jesus Christ did for us. In spite of the cancer of sin that lies within us, Jesus came and died for each one of us. God gave his Son for us, for our salvation. Several decades ago, there was a missionary in Irian Jaya, an island in the South Pacific. Don Richardson and his family were there, and they were trying to share the gospel with the Sawi people. And they were there for months and could not figure out a way that the gospel message would resonate with the people. And it was exacerbated by their culture. The culture said that if somebody was kind to you, then you were to look at that kindness with suspicion. So think about what you would do if you were there as missionaries. If you did something kind, you were creating suspicion. Or if you were sharing the gospel with somebody, you were creating suspicion. Well, one day, after several months and a lot of prayer, finally the key opened up. And in that culture, there is one exception to kindness being viewed at without suspicion. And that is if one tribe member who's at war with another tribe member, if one of the fathers in tribe number 1 offers his son to tribe number 2, then tribe number 2 says tribe number 1 can be trusted. And they would call this son given to tribe number 2 the peace child. And whoever touched the peace child in tribe number 2 would be brought into a friendly relationship with the people in tribe number 1. This is what God has done for us. He has offered his peace child, Jesus Christ, in order to bring us into relationship with him. Let's pray together. Father, there is so much in this passage. I pray and ask that for each one of us who are hearing this message, that you would take some nugget, some idea, something that each one of us needs to hear, needs to apply, needs to remember, needs to act out in some way as your children. Open our eyes to see what you have for us in this passage. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.